The meeting was never supposed to happen. Not because secret meetings are unusual in the upper architecture of the Islamic Republic. They are not. The theology of governance that the Islamic Republic practices has always operated through layers of formal institution and informal reality, through the visible parliamentary sessions and the invisible conversations that actually determine what the visible sessions ratify. Secret meetings are not anomalies in the Islamic Republic's decision-making structure. They are the structure. The formal institutions, the parliament, the presidency, the guardian council, the expediency council, are the performance of governance. The real decisions happen in rooms that do not appear on official schedules, between people whose attendance does not appear in official records, about matters whose substance does not appear in official minutes. This meeting was not supposed to happen because the specific combination of people who attended it, assembled in the same room at the same moment, represents a configuration of the Islamic Republic's power structure that has not existed before. A configuration that the specific, terminal, simultaneously failing conditions of the summer of 2026 forced into existence. A configuration whose very occurrence tells you more about where the Islamic Republic stands than anything that was said inside it. Because the attendance list itself is the signal that the people who built this system, who have run this system, who have defended this system against every challenge for 46 years, have concluded that the system as it currently exists cannot continue and have sat down together to decide what that means. What was decided in that room will end the regime, not because the decision was hostile to the regime's survival. The people in that room have no interest in the regime's destruction. Every person who attended has spent their adult life inside the Islamic Republic's institutional architecture. Every person who attended has personal, professional, financial, and in some cases physical survival interests that are deeply entangled with the continuation of some version of the system they built. The decision that was reached is not the decision of people who want the regime to end. It is the decision of people who have concluded that the regime as it currently exists is already ending, that the question is no longer whether it ends, but what it ends into, and that the specific ending that serves their survival and the survival of whatever version of the system can be salvaged from the collapse requires a decision that the regime's own logic makes impossible to announce, and whose announcement would itself constitute the ending it describes. What was decided will end the regime because it was the decision that could only be made by people who had already accepted that the regime is ending. Let us start with a number that explains why this meeting happened now, in this specific week, with this specific attendance, producing this specific decision rather than the weeks or months earlier when the conditions that made it necessary were already visibly forming. The number is 11 days. That is the window. The specific, finite, arithmetically calculated, operationally confirmed window between the U.S. Navy's sealing of the Strait of Hormuz, reducing Iran's oil revenue to zero, and the point at which Iran's foreign currency reserves will be exhausted at the minimum payment rates required to maintain the fraction of institutional function that still distinguishes the Islamic Republic from a failed state. Not 22 to 39 days. 11. Because the bank run dynamic that zero revenue triggers, the simultaneous individual calculations of every government employee, every institutional actor, every financial participant in the Iranian system who has received the information about the reserve timeline and is rationally preparing for the moment the payments stop rather than waiting for that moment to arrive, has accelerated the reserve depletion to a rate that the minimum payment model understated. 11 days. The people in that room knew the number. They knew it because they have access to the actual treasury figures that the official public statements obscure. They knew it because the central bank's internal reporting, which they receive rather than the public figures, shows the reserve depletion curve and its intersection with the zero line with a precision that eliminates the ambiguity that external analysts are managing with their 22 to 39 day estimates. They knew that the meeting they were attending was not a meeting about managing a crisis. It was a meeting about managing an ending, and that the difference between managing an ending well and managing it badly is measured in the specific human, historical weight of what happens to the people in the room when the ending arrives, without management, versus when it arrives having been shaped by the people who attended the meeting. The attendance itself requires careful examination because it is the most significant signal about what the meeting was and what it produced. The meeting was attended by a specific subset of the clerical establishment, not the hardline ideologues whose institutional survival is completely bound to the continuation of the system in its current form, and not the reformists whose marginalization from real power has made them irrelevant to any decision that actually matters. It was attended by the pragmatist faction, the people who have always existed within the Islamic Republic's clerical structure as the quiet, calculating, institutionally embedded voice of survival over ideology, the people who supported Rafsanjani's economic opening in the 1990s, who supported Khatami's reform era as a pressure valve, who supported the nuclear deal as a financial lifeline, who have consistently, across 46 years of the Islamic Republic's history, been willing to trade ideological purity for institutional survival whenever the calculation required it. Those people were in the room, together, without the IRGC command representatives, who have been quarantining the supreme leader and blocking every civilian governance initiative and preventing President Pezeshkian from convening the emergency sessions that the crisis requires, without the hardline clerics whose presence would have converted the pragmatist discussion into the factional paralysis that has been preventing coherent institutional response to the crisis, without the official institutional designations that would have made the meeting a formal proceeding, whose minutes would be distributed to the IRGC's intelligence apparatus that monitors every formal proceeding of every Islamic Republic institution. The meeting was attended by the pragmatist clerical faction, without the IRGC, without the hardliners, in a location that did not appear on any official schedule, with attendance that was not recorded in any official institutional document. This is the specific configuration that tells you what the meeting was. It was the clerical establishment's pragmatist faction holding the conversation that the IRGC's institutional capture of the Iranian state has been preventing from happening through official channels, the conversation about what the Islamic Republic can survive becoming versus what it cannot survive remaining, held by the people who have the institutional standing within the clerical hierarchy to give its conclusions weight, and the specific conditions of privacy that the IRGC's surveillance of official proceedings makes impossible in any formal setting. The content of what was discussed and what was decided has reached external intelligence through 3 separate source streams that have been corroborated against each other. The diaspora networks that have been the primary intelligence pipeline for information about internal Iranian deliberations throughout the crisis, the regional intelligence services whose human source penetration of the Iranian clerical establishment is deeper than their penetration of the IRGC's military command, and the signals that the communications of the meeting's attendees produced in the days following it that are consistent with the decision the sources describe having been made. The decision was this. The pragmatist clerical faction has concluded that the Islamic Republic in its current form, with IRGC operational control of the state, with the supreme leader quarantined, with the elected government unable to govern, with 0 revenue and 11 days of reserves and the entire external relationship architecture exhausted, cannot be salvaged through any internal adjustment that leaves the fundamental power configuration intact. That the specific form of the Islamic Republic that the IRGC command has constructed through its institutional capture, the form in which a paramilitary organization controls the state, while the clerical establishment that was supposed to be the system's theological foundation provides legitimating cover for decisions it has no input into, is the form that is ending, and that the question the pragmatist faction is positioned to influence is not whether that form ends, but what succeeds it. What was decided in that room is the clerical pragmatist faction's answer to that question. And the answer is the decision that ends the regime as it currently exists, because it requires dismantling the specific institutional configuration that the current regime represents. The decision has 3 components. The first component is the withdrawal of clerical legitimacy from the IRGC command's continued control of the Iranian state. This is not an announcement. It is not a press release or a public statement or a formal declaration through any institutional channel. It is the specific, quiet, operationally significant decision of the clerical establishment's pragmatist faction to stop providing the theological validation that the IRGC's governance of Iran has depended on for the period since it completed its institutional capture of the state. The IRGC's authority to govern Iran rests, in the Islamic Republic's own theological framework, on the legitimacy granted to it by the clerical establishment's endorsement of its actions as consistent with the principles of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist that is the theological foundation of the entire system. When the clerical establishment withdraws that endorsement, the IRGC's governance is not just practically failing, it is theologically illegitimate within the system's own framework. And theological illegitimacy within an Islamic Republic is not a minor institutional complication. It is the specific, foundational, regime-defining category of failure that cannot be managed through force alone. The second component is the activation of the communication channel to Washington that President Pezeshkian has been attempting to open, and the IRGC command has been blocking. The pragmatist clerical faction has the standing, the relationships, and the institutional authority within the Islamic Republic's clerical hierarchy to activate that channel over the IRGC's objection, in ways that Pezeshkian's civilian presidency cannot. A communication that originates from the clerical pragmatist faction, from the people who represent the theological legitimacy of the Islamic Republic in its original constitutional conception, is not a communication that the IRGC command can simply suppress as easily as it suppresses civilian presidential initiatives. It carries theological weight that the IRGC's military authority does not possess, and that the IRGC's institutional logic has no framework for addressing. What that communication proposes, the specific terms of the engagement that the pragmatist faction has decided to initiate, is the dimension of the decision that external sources have been least able to corroborate with precision. The broad outlines are consistent across the source streams. A willingness to address the nuclear program in terms that go beyond previous Iranian positions, a proposal for a transition of governance away from the IRGC command toward a civilian clerical arrangement that the pragmatist faction controls, and a request for the specific economic lifeline that stopping the financial countdown would require. But the specifics, the exact terms, the verification mechanisms, the sequencing of Iranian concessions against American responses, are the dimensions that the intelligence pipeline from the meeting cannot fully reconstruct, because those specifics were the subject of the most sensitive part of the discussion, and the part whose security was most carefully managed by the people attending. The third component is the most consequential and the most dangerous for the people who decided it. It is the decision to communicate the withdrawal of clerical legitimacy to the senior IRGC commanders whose personal calculations about institutional loyalty versus personal survival are currently in the most active stage of the transition from the first to the second. The pragmatist faction has concluded that the IRGC's institutional paralysis, the decision paralysis that the combined pressure of zero revenue, complete air defense irrelevance, targeting solution completeness, and every other simultaneous failure has produced in the IRGC command, creates a window in which the specific communication of clerical withdrawal of legitimacy, delivered to the right commanders at the right moment through the right channels, can accelerate the personal survival calculation in the direction that the managed transition option requires. In simpler terms, the mullahs decided to tell the generals that God is no longer on their side. And in the specific institutional and theological context of the Islamic Republic, where the general's authority has always derived from the clerical endorsement that frames their power as theologically legitimate rather than merely militarily coercive, that communication is not a political message. It is the removal of the foundation on which the entire structure rests. Think about what this means in the internal logic of the Islamic Republic. The IRGC was not created as a conventional military organization. It was created as the armed expression of the Islamic Revolution's theological principles, as the force that would protect the revolution and its velayat-e-faqih governance structure from the enemies that the revolutionary clerics identified as threatening it. Its authority to govern, to suppress, to control, to make the decisions that have made it the effective ruler of Iran since its institutional capture of the state was complete. All of it derived from the theological framework that the clerical establishment provided and that the clerical establishment is now withdrawing. An IRGC command that has lost clerical legitimacy is not simply an IRGC command that has lost political support. In the Islamic Republic's own institutional logic, it is an IRGC command that has lost the one source of authority that distinguishes its governance from the simple military rule that the Islamic Republic's own constitutional and theological framework explicitly condemns. It is an institution that has become, in the framework of the system it was created to protect, exactly what the revolution claimed it was overthrowing: military force without theological legitimacy, power without divine sanction, the gun without God. For IRGC commanders who have spent their careers inside the Islamic Republic's institutional framework, who have understood their authority as theologically grounded rather than merely militarily coercive, who have maintained the performance of religious observance and revolutionary principle that the IRGC's institutional culture requires as the justification for the authority it exercises, the withdrawal of clerical legitimacy is the specific, individually experienced, personally destabilizing event that changes the personal survival calculation in ways that external military pressure and financial collapse alone cannot produce. External pressure changes the calculation of whether the institution survives. The withdrawal of clerical legitimacy changes the calculation of whether the institution deserves to survive. And in the specific psychological profile of the people whose personal identity is bound up with the Islamic Republic's institutional framework, that is a different and more powerful calculation than the purely strategic one. The IRGC commanders who received the communication from the pragmatist clerical faction, and the communication has been delivered through the specific informal channels that connect the clerical hierarchy to the military command in the parallel institutional architecture of the Islamic Republic that operates alongside and beneath the formal one, are now managing the intersection of two simultaneous calculations. The strategic calculation that the external pressure is making about institutional survival, and the personal theological identity level calculation that the clerical withdrawal of legitimacy is making about whether the institution they are being asked to maintain their loyalty to is the institution they understood themselves to be serving. That intersection is where managed transitions happen, not in diplomatic negotiations or formal institutional procedures or publicly announced policy reversals. In the specific, private, individual moment where a sufficient number of people in positions of authority make the same calculation simultaneously that the cost of maintaining the current arrangement exceeds the cost of moving toward the alternative arrangement, and where the alternative arrangement has been made specific enough, credible enough, and personally safe enough for the individuals whose movement toward it is required to make it real. The pragmatist clerical factions meeting did three things simultaneously toward that intersection. It withdrew theological legitimacy from the current arrangement. It activated the communication channel that makes the alternative arrangement possible. And it communicated directly to the individual commanders, whose personal calculation is closest to the transition threshold that the theological withdrawal has occurred and that the alternative is being actively prepared. But there is a dimension of what was decided in that room that carries a risk, that the sources describing it acknowledge, that the pragmatist faction's own internal deliberations apparently addressed with significant concern. The decision to move toward managed transition, to activate the Washington Channel, to withdraw clerical legitimacy from the IRGC command, this decision, if it becomes known to the IRGC command before the transition has advanced to the point where the command cannot reverse it, produces the specific, dangerous response of an institution that has concluded it is being moved against. An IRGC command that discovers the clerical pragmatist faction is withdrawing legitimacy and activating a Washington Channel is not an IRGC command that becomes more open to the managed transition option. It is an IRGC command that becomes more likely to execute the final desperate escalation that every analyst of the crisis has identified as the most dangerous scenario. The nuclear acceleration, the last proxy activation, the final coercive action that costs everything and produces the escalatory response that the IRGC command has concluded, is equivalent in its personal consequences to every other option. The pragmatist faction knows this. The meeting's deliberations apparently included significant discussion of the operational security of the decision itself, of how to advance the transition far enough, fast enough, that the IRGC command's discovery of what is happening occurs at a point where reversal is impossible rather than at a point where escalatory response is still available. This is the specific, dangerous, historically momentous race that the meeting set in motion. The race between the managed transition advancing far enough to be irreversible and the IRGC command discovering what is happening and escalating before irreversibility is reached. The race that every major authoritarian collapse has run in its final phase, between the institutional reformers trying to manage the transition and the hardliners trying to prevent it, with the outcome determining whether the ending is managed or catastrophic. The Soviet Union ran this race and the reformers reached irreversibility first. Romania ran this race and the hardliners escalated first. The Shah's Iran ran this race and the military's calculations shifted fast enough that the hardliners' escalation capacity dissolved before it could be used. Iran is running this race right now. The Mullahs' secret meeting fired the starting gun. The 11 days of reserves is the clock. The IRGC command's surveillance of the clerical establishment's informal communications is the threat to the race's outcome. And the 85 million people whose lives will be determined by which side reaches its goal first are the stakes. History has seen this exact configuration before. The specific moment when the theological foundation of an authoritarian system's legitimacy is withdrawn by the institution that provided it, when the church steps back from the state, when the ideological guarantor of the system's right to power stops guaranteeing it, is the moment that every subsequent analysis of how the system ended identifies as the turning point, not the military defeat, not the financial collapse, not the popular uprising, the withdrawal of legitimacy by the legitimating institution. Because legitimacy is not a performance that can be continued indefinitely when the performers have decided to stop. And when it stops, the system that depended on it is not weakened. It is hollowed, the form remains, the content is gone. The mullahs held their secret meeting. They made the decision that only people who have accepted an ending can make. They withdrew their theological endorsement from the institution that has been governing in their name. They activated the channel that makes the alternative possible. And they delivered the communication to the commanders whose personal calculation determines whether the alternative becomes real. The meeting is over. The decision has been made. The race has started. The 11 days are running. The IRGC command does not yet know what was decided. Or perhaps it does. Or perhaps it knows enough to suspect and is making its own calculations about what suspicion requires. That uncertainty, the uncertainty about whether the race has already been decided by information that one side has and the other does not, is the most dangerous space in the entire Iran crisis. And we are all inside it right now. along with 85 million people who did not choose to be there and who will live with the outcome of whatever is decided in the space between what the mullahs decided and what the generals discover. If what you just heard gave you an understanding of what the secret meeting actually means, not the dramatic headline version, not the 90-second summary, but the specific, operational, theologically weighted, historically precedented significance of the clerical pragmatist faction making the decision that only people who have accepted an ending can make, then share this with one person who is trying to understand what is happening. The race that the meeting started is the most consequential race running in the world right now. The people who understand it when it finishes will be the people who were watching it before it became the headline. Drop your answer in the comments to the question the meeting makes unavoidable. The mullahs decided. The generals don't know yet. The 11 days are running. If you had to bet on which side reaches its goal first, the managed transition the pragmatist faction is racing toward, or the escalatory response the IRGC command would execute if it discovers what was decided before irreversibility is reached, which side wins? Comment below, because the analysis in this community has been ahead of every development in this crisis. Be ahead of the most important one. Subscribe. Because the race that started in that room is going to produce a result that every other story about Iran has been building toward. And when it does, the people who were watching from the beginning will understand what everyone else will spend weeks trying to explain. The meeting happened. The decision was made. The race is running. And the regime that was built in that room 46 years ago is being ended by the people who built it, in a room that nobody was supposed to know about, with a decision that nobody was supposed to hear. You heard it. Now watch what it produces.